Hello, I'm Steve Yarwood and welcome to Into the Unknown. In Brazil, during the 1950s worldwide UFO flap, came a report of one of the most bizarre accounts on record, the abduction, or perhaps, I should say seduction, of Antonio Villas Boas. This is the first recorded incident of a UFO abduction in the modern age, and it happened to the 23-year-old Brazilian on October the 15th, 1957. It also stands as a well-documented physical case, with doctors examining the effects after his encounter. Researcher Bruce Rooks relates, reluctant to tell his story, Boas was convinced by Dr. Olavo T. Fontes, Professor of Medicine at the National School of Medicine of Brazil and also an APRO representative, Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation, to publicly relate what happened, which he did on February the 22nd of the following year to Fontes, journalist Joás Martins and a Brazilian military intelligence agent. Boas has been found to be suffering from radiation poisoning, and Fontes was curious. Among the symptoms were pains throughout the body, nausea, headaches, loss of appetite, ceaselessly burning sensations in the eyes, cutaneous lesions at the slightest of light bruising, and these went on appearing for months, looking like small reddish nodules, harder than the skin around them and protuberant, painful when touched, and each with a small central orifice yielding a yellowish thin watering discharge. The skin surrounding the wounds presented a hyperchromatic violet-tinged area. The military intelligence man interrogated Boas, and he was subjected to a battery of physical and psychological tests. The most conservative ufologist accepts his abduction as an actual occurrence. While the actual abduction occurred on the 15th, his strange encounters began 10 days earlier. A little after 11 p.m. on October the 5th, Boas spotted a bright white light in the sky as he opened the window to get some air. Later that night, after sleeping for a while, Boas awoke and looked again to find the same light still there, moving towards him as he looked at it. Frightened, he slammed the shutters, waking his brother, who watched with some astonishment as the bright light played through the shutters a while before leaving. Boas lived on his family's farm. They had several fields and plantations that they farmed at night to beat the heat of the daytime heat. On the 14th, around 9 to 10 p.m, Boas again with his brother were out tilling the fields when they both witnessed an extremely bright light a little over 300 feet above their heads. Boas, leaving his brother behind, set out to investigate. As he got closer, it suddenly darted away at tremendous speed to the opposite end of the field. He approached it again, and again it darted away, back to where it had started from. This manoeuvre was repeated no less than 20 times, and finally, discouraged, Boas returned to his brother. Boas said, the light kept still for a few moments longer in the distance. Now and again it seemed to throw forth rays in all directions, the same as the setting sun, sparkling. Then it suddenly disappeared as if it had been turned off. I'm not quite sure if this is what exactly happened, for I cannot remember if I kept looking at the same direction all the time. Maybe for a few seconds I glanced elsewhere, so it may have lifted up and disappeared before I had the time to look back at it again. The next night he worked the fields alone, and when he was at the same spot he and his brother had witnessed the light the night before, he saw a reddish light in the sky which zoomed toward him at remarkable speed. So quickly that it was on top of me before I could make up my mind what to do about it, said Boas. About 160 feet above his head it stopped suddenly. This light was so intense that he couldn't see his tractor's headlights through it. Boas said it looked like a large elongated egg with several technical features about it. 3 legs extended from beneath it, and as it settled to land, Boas ran to his tractor in terror. When he reached it, the tractor and its lights died. Making his escape out to the other side and running towards the house, his arm was grabbed by a small figure which only reached his shoulder, in strange clothes which he violently shoved away. 3 more small figures surrounded him and lifted him off the ground by the arms. Boas described these creatures in great detail. All of them wore a very tight-fitting siren suit, made of soft, thick, unevenly striped grey material. This garment reached up to their necks, where it was joined to a kind of helmet made of a grey material that looked stiffer and was strengthened back at nose level. Their helmets hid everything except their eyes, which were protected by 2 round glasses, like the lenses in ordinary glasses. Through them, the men looked at me, and their eyes seemed to be much smaller than ours, though I believe that may have been the effect of the lenses. All of them had light-coloured eyes that looked blue to me, but this I cannot vouch for. Above their eyes, those helmets looked so tall that they corresponded to what the double of the size of a normal head should be. Probably there was something else hidden under those helmets, placed on top of their heads, but nothing could be seen from the outside. Right on top, from the middle of their heads, there sprouted 3 round silvery metal tubes. I can't tell whether they were made of metal or of rubber, which were a little narrower than a common garden hose. The tubes, which were placed one in the middle and one on each side of their heads, were smooth and bent backwards and downwards towards the back. There they fitted into their clothes. How, I cannot say, but one went down the centre where the backbone is, and the other 2, one on each side, fitting under the shoulders at about 4 inches from the armpits, nearly at the sides where the back begins. I didn't notice anything at all, no hump or lump to show where the tubes were attached, nor any box or contrivance hidden under their clothes. Their sleeves were narrow and tight-fitting to the wrist, where they were followed by thick 5-fingered gloves of the same colour that must have somehow hindered their movements. As to this, I noticed that the men weren't able to double their fingers together, so much to touch the palm of their hands with the tips of their fingers. The difficulty did not prevent them from catching and holding me firmly, nor from deftly manipulating the rubber tubes for extracting my blood. Those overalls must have been some kind of uniform, for all the members of the crew wore a red badge the size of a pineapple slice on their chest, and sometimes reflected in a shiny light. Not a light of its own, but reflections such as those given by the rear lights of a car when another car lights it up from behind. From this centre badge there came a strip of silvery material, or it might have been flattened metal, which joined onto a broad, tight-fitting, claspless belt, the colour of which I can't remember. No pocket could be seen anywhere, and I don't remember seeing any buttons either. The trousers were also tight-fitting over the buttocks, thighs and legs, and there wasn't a wrinkle nor a crease to be seen. There was no visible hem between the trousers and shoes, which were actually a continuation of the former, being part of the self-same garment. The soles of their shoes were different from ours. They were thick, about 2 or 3 inches thick, and a little turned up or arched up in front, so that the tips looked like those described in the fairy tales of old, though the general appearance was that of common tennis shoes. From what I saw later, they must have fitted loosely, for they were larger than the feet they covered. In spite of this, the men's gait was free and easy, and their movements were swift indeed. Perhaps the close siren suit they wore did interfere slightly with their movement, because they kept walking very stiffly. They were all about my height, about 1.64 metres tall in shoes, perhaps a little shorter because of those helmets, except for one of them, the one who had caught hold of me out there. This one didn't even reach my chin. All seemed strong, but not so strong that I fought with them, and one at a time I should have been afraid of losing, and I believed that in a free-for-all fight I could face any single one of them on an equal basis. It's interesting to note the similarities between Boas's descriptions and the creature's clothing and that of fairies. The unevenly striped uniforms sound not unlike the sort of party-coloured clothing design one might expect on an elf or perhaps an evil jester, researcher Bruce Rook speculates, even with bent hoses sticking out the head like tasselled bells on jesters' caps. At this point, while resisting as best he could, Boas found himself being pulled up a flexible metallic rolling ladder into a hatchway which closed behind them. It was so neat that no seam was visible to the naked eye, he said. Now he found himself inside a small square room, bare of furnishings, brightly lit, the same as broad daylight, by recessed small lights in the smooth metallic walls. Suddenly, an opening appeared from the seamless wall, and Boas was led into another room. He said the only furnishings visible was an oddly shaped table that stood at one end of the room, surrounded by several backless swivel chairs, something like bar stools. They were all made of the same white metal. The table as well as the stools were one-legged, narrowing towards the floor where they were either fixed, such as the table, or to a linked, movable ring held fast by 3 hinges jutting out on each side and riveted to that floor, such as the stools, so those sitting on them could turn in every direction. His abductors then grabbed him and held him in place while communicating in sounds that Boas said had no resemblance whatever to human speech, and that he could think of no attempts to describe those sounds, so different were they from anything that he'd heard before. He said, those sounds still make me shiver when I think of them. It isn't even possible for me to reproduce them. My vocal organs are not made for it. He compared the sounds to animal grunts, some longer, others shorter, sometimes containing several different sounds at the same time, at other times ending in a tremor. Curiously, these creatures then began undressing him despite his constant opposition. Boas continues, they obviously couldn't understand me, but they stopped and stared at me as if trying to make me understand that they were being polite. Besides, though they had to employ force, they never at any time hurt me badly, and didn't even tear my clothes with the exception of perhaps my shirt. Stripped naked, they rubbed him all over with thick, clear, odourless liquid, and then was prompted into another room with red inscriptions over the door. Again, Boas said they were like scribbles of a kind entirely unknown to us. He would also recount that soon 2 of the figures joined him, carrying apparatuses which they took some blood from his chin, leaving small scars that were later noticed by the doctors at the hospital, but that caused him no pain and only minimal discomfort. Boas says he was left alone for about an hour and made himself comfortable on a large featureless foam rubber grey bed or couch in the middle of the room, with no legs. From holes in the wall from about the height of his head came tufts of grey smoke that quickly dissolved. At first Boas felt nauseated and as though he was being suffocated. Then he rushed to one corner of the room, vomited, and after that his breathing was easier. A little while later a door opened and in walked a naked woman. According to researcher Ralph Blum, Villas Boas speculated that the clear liquid was an aphrodisiac. To my mind, the logic of the story suggests that it was a germicide of some kind, and that the smoke was a chemical that permitted the alien to breathe without a helmet, seeing the rest of the crew wore helmets throughout the encounter. It could be that the blood was relevant to some criteria of interbreeding. She came in slowly, unhurriedly, perhaps a little amused at the amazement she saw written on my face, said Boas. I stared open-mouthed. She was beautiful, though of a different kind of beauty compared with that of other women I've known. Her hair was blonde, nearly white, like hair dyed in peroxide. It was smooth, not very thick, with a part in the centre, and she had big blue eyes, rather longer than round, for they slanted outward, like those pencil-drawn girls made to look like Arabian princesses that look as if they were slit, except that they were natural. There was no make-up. Her nose was straight, not pointed, not turned up, nor too big. The contour of her face was different, though not because she had very high prominent cheekbones that made her face narrow to a peak, so that all of a sudden it ended into a pointed chin, which gave the lower part of her face a very pointed look. Her lips were very thin, nearly invisible. Her ears, which I only saw later, were small and didn't seem different from ordinary ears. Her high cheekbones gave one the impression that there was a broken bone somewhere underneath, but as I discovered later they were soft and fleshy to the touch, so they did not seem to be made of bone. Her body was much more beautiful than any I had seen before. It was slim, and her breast stood up high and well separated. Her waistline was thin, her belly flat, her hips well developed, and her thighs were large. Her feet were small, her hands long and narrow. Her fingers and nails were normal. She was much shorter than I am. Her head only reached my shoulder. Her skin was white, as of that of fair women on earth, and she was full of freckles on her arms. I didn't notice any perfume except for a natural female odour, and another thing I noticed was that the hair in her armpits was bright red, nearly the colour of blood. Bruce Rooks pointed out that a later recounting of Boas's story included the mention that her pubic hair was also bright red, which may have been omitted from the original publication of Boas' encounter due to the sexual mores of the time. Details of his encounter which followed were not published either, but apparently he did discuss them, albeit with some embarrassment, when relating his story to Dr. Fontes and Mr. Martins. Boas recounts that the woman came towards him in silence, looking at me all the while as she wanted something from me. Pressing herself to him, he understood what the purpose was, and he said, I began to get excited. I ended up forgetting everything and held the woman close to me, corresponding to her favours with greater ones of my own. Apparently they had 2 sexual encounters and performed a variety of acts together for about an hour, after which the woman pulled away to leave. Boas continues, all they wanted was a good stallion to improve their stock, Boas said. He said that he enjoyed the encounter even if the woman refused to kiss. Bruce Rooks remarked that after all he'd just thrown up. Instead, the woman preferred to bite his chin while making sounds that in Boas's mind sounded like animal growls. She never spoke, and when they were finished, one of the creatures entered and called out to the woman. But before leaving she pointed to her belly and, smiling, as well as she could smile, pointed to the sky southward. Then she went away. Boas interpreted the signs as meaning to say that she intended to return and take him with her to wherever she lived. Boas seemed to be concerned, or even afraid, about the last bit, for he took the meaning quite seriously and wasn't sure if he was anxious to leave his familiar surroundings or his family, Rooks writes. After fetching the woman, the creature returned Boas's clothes. He was led back to the room with the stools and table, where the crew sat and communicated with each other in their strange way, but ignoring him. He felt altogether calm, for I knew no harm would come to me, he said. Now he had a chance to take stock of all the surroundings, and he tried to remember all he could. He noticed that the walls were smooth, metal and hard with no windows anywhere. Noticing a box with a glass top that had an appearance of an alarm clock, he attempted to conceal it. Noticing this, one of the crew seized it instantly and shoved him back. Jacques Vallée said that Boas described the clock as having one hand and several marks that would correspond to the 3, 6, 9 and 12 of an ordinary clock. However, although time passed, the hand didn't move, and Antonio concluded that it wasn't a clock. The symbolism in this remark by Villas Boas is clear, Vallée says. We are reminded of the fairy tales of the country where time doesn't pass, and of that great poet who in his room had a large white clock without hands, bearing the word, "It's later than you think." The creatures continued to lead him through the ship, pointing out various interesting features which Boas described at length with a remarkable account of detail. Boas stressed there was no doubt in his mind whatsoever that he was aboard a metal craft. The tour finally over, one of the figures gestured to him down the ladder and then pointed to itself, and then to the ground, and then in a southerly direction to the sky, the same direction that the woman had pointed. Boas was signalled to step back and the ladder retracted, the ship rose, the tripod landing structure retracted, so smoothly that once in place no sign of the opening through which it emerged was visible. It stopped a little over 100 feet above his head, growing increasingly brighter, and the buzz formed by the dislocation of the air lauder and the revolving saucer began to rotate at a terrific speed, while the light turned to many shades of colour, finally settling on a bright red. As this happened, the machine abruptly changed direction by turning unexpectedly and producing a larger noise with a kind of shock. When this was over, the strange airship darted off suddenly like a bullet southward, holding itself slightly askew at such a heady speed that it disappeared from sight in a few seconds. It was about 5:30 in the morning when Boas returned to his tractor, by his reckoning 4¼ hours from the time that it had been picked up. He discovered the tractor had been sabotaged, presumably during the scuffle, meaning that his abductors were smart enough to know he would try escaping, and they had knowledge of how a tractor works. The battery wires had been detached. For about 3 months after his encounter, Boas suffered various mild medical ailments such as those described previously, and excessive sleepiness, a trait commonly found in subsequent abduction cases. The man who initially investigated the case and examined Villas Boas has quite an interesting background too. In the spring of 1957, Dr. Olavo T. Fontes, a gastroenterologist at the National School of Medicine in Rio de Janeiro, joined APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation, an American UFO organisation, as representative for Brazil. Brazil had been visited by flying saucers in the early 50s. But with Fontes joining the organisation, the APRO files began to bulge with the cases he investigated and filed. A professor at the National School, Fontes was also in private practice, and his time was pretty much his own. He told the Lorenzans, who had founded APRO, that he thought the saucers were a typical Yankee phenomena until they showed up in Brazil. It seems that as soon as Fontes joined APRO, Brazil's UFO literally exploded. On September the 14th, 1957, Ibrahim Sued, a well-known Rio de Janeiro society colonist, reported that he had received information, in fact a fragment of a flying disc. The story was apparently sent in by a reader of his popular column. The letter began, "I wish to give you something of the highest interest to a newspaperman about the flying discs. If you believe they are real, of course. I didn't believe anything said or published about them, but just a few days ago I was forced to change my mind." The man claimed he was fishing at a place close to the town of Ubatuba, Sao Paulo, when he saw a flying disc. It approached the beach at unbelievable speed, and an accident, i.e. a crash into the sea, seemed imminent. At the last moment, however, when it was almost striking the waters, it made a sharp turn upwards and climbed rapidly on a fantastic impulse. We followed the spectacle with our eyes, startled, when we saw the disc explode in flames. It disintegrated into thousands of fiery fragments which fell sparkling with magnificent brightness. Most of these fragments, well, almost all, fell into the sea, but a number of small pieces fell close to the beach, and we picked up a large amount of this material, which was as light as paper, and I am enclosed in a small sample of it. Sued had, it seemed, been handed the UFO Holy Grail, but already the first problem was that signature of the person sending the letter was illegible, and no address was given. Fontes contacted Sued on the day the article appeared and immediately went to his apartment to see the fragment of the journalist's apartment. 3 small pieces of dull grey solid substance that appeared to be a metal of some sort. A professional analysis of the sample a few days later revealed that the metal was magnesium, and extremely high purity. That was in itself of some interest, but hardly the Holy Grail. A few months later, in February 1958, Fontes himself became the subject of UFO attention. He stated that he was warned off by American and Brazilian officials. The officials claimed to be from naval intelligence, and they wanted him to stop his work into UFOs. Remarkably, after having warned him off, the officers then confided in him that 6 UFOs had crashed throughout the world since the Second World War. 3 in North America, 1 in the Sahara, 1 in Scandinavia and 1 in Britain. In his report about the encounter to APRO, he wrote, "I was told all of these discs were small craft, 32, 77 or 99 feet in diameter. In all of them were found crew members' bodies. They were little men and ranged in height from 32 to 46 inches. They were dead in all cases, killed in the crashes. The examination of the bodies showed they were definitely humanoid, but obviously not from this planet." This admission to Fontes has been regarded by some UFO researchers as being amongst the best evidence for international government knowledge of an extraterrestrial presence on Earth. But even from Fontes' account, it's clear that this was, in fact, an exercise in misinformation and myth-making. Why would Brazilian army officials, ostensibly trying to discourage Fontes' research, share information with him that was supposedly even being withheld from the country's president? And why was Fontes then allowed to publish an account of his experience? Intelligent, methodical, fluent in English, and with friends in the Brazilian military's upper echelon, he was accused by some ufologists of collaborating with intelligence agencies within his own country and with the United States. His constant travels to that country as a representative of the defunct APRO organisation, spearheaded by Jim and Coral Lorenzen, caused even greater mistrust. All appears to suggest that Fontes was closely tied to US authorities and privy to a number of ufological secrets. He died young, in 1968, from a quick-spreading cancer. Some believe that Fontes was the victim of a conspiracy that also cut short the lives of other ufologists who knew too much. Antonio Villas Boas withdrew from public life to continue his studies, receiving a law degree and become a practicing attorney in the city of Formosa, Goiás. He died in 1992 in the city of Uberaba in Brazil's Triângulo Mineiro.